Thank you, Jessica. I'm excited to welcome you all to our webinar on predictive analytics. This webinar is part of the Civic Analytics Network Initiative, a peer network of chief data officers from across the country. For more on CAN and many other resources on data-driven government, please visit datasmartcities.org. I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Tom Schenk and Sean Thornton. Tom is the Chief Data Officer for the City of Chicago, as well as the founding chair of CAN. Sean Thornton is the Program Advisor for the Civic Analytics Network and a writer for Data Smart City Solutions based in Chicago. With that, I'll turn it over to Tom and Sean to get started. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I'm happy to be chatting with you today and talking a little bit about predictive analytics in the city and how we've been able to do some of our organization here to be able to get that done. I'd like to briefly introduce you to Sean Thornton and get you used to his voice as well.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for attending our webinar, and we're looking forward to sharing analytics of practical guides, talking about how we use analytics here in Chicago.
So we hope to take you through specific use cases here. We're going to be talking about a number of things. The two things that we want to communicate is we want to talk about the 10 steps that we go through to be able to complete research projects. It serves as a helpful guide in organizing your own team, your analytical team or your data team, but also organizing how you work with others and organizing that client relationship, something that within my team we refer to as our clients, the departments, the community, and making sure that we're servicing them well and also be able to plan projects and set expectations for others about what is going to happen and what should be happening next. For today, we're going to be using an example, a food inspection example, a project where we predicted food inspections or which restaurant is going to fail a food inspection. So we're going to be talking about these 10 steps in light of that particular project, just to provide a singular use case that is written about and published about, so you can go and see what the actual project is. And then at the end, we're going to talk about a couple other projects and particular problems that they raised and how we modified the 10 steps to be able to meet those particular needs. So again, these 10 steps is meant as a guide, as a framework, not a rule of law that we follow. And so we want to throw in a couple of curveballs and show you how we've adapted those 10 steps to be able to solve particular use cases. Okay, so the first thing in Chicago, when we talk about analytics or anything with technology, our main vision is that in Chicago, we believe that the power of technology is driven by the people who use and benefit from it. That is to say that the user, the folks who are using analytics, the folks that are going to be able to leverage an algorithm to get something done, what matters is serving their need. The deliverable that we are trying to create is not the algorithm itself. What we're trying to create is a useful tool to guide decision-making practices that ultimately benefits efficiency and also benefits the managers and the workforce in Chicago, so they feel that their job is a little bit easier. And that's what we're trying to do at the end of the day. So the Applied Analytics Guide is a 10-step process that we use to identify and analyze and address important problems. We think, again, it's useful as a guide to guide operational efficiency, to improve effectiveness, and improve quality of life of residents. And it's something, again, that helps us organize our team and also organize the clients that we work with so they have an expectation of what's coming next. We think this is useful because when it comes to the use of analytics, especially advanced analytics, not many people are familiar with it. So this 10-step guide gives them a map of what's to come next and how long they should expect a project to last so they can become more accustomed to it and so they can have expectations themselves. So the first step that we have is identifying the problem itself. So when the concept of food inspections, the City of Chicago has 15,000 restaurants, and we have about 34 inspectors to inspect all of those restaurants. And in the news, one of the ways that we're identifying problems is simply in seeing what's happening in the news. And so there was a period of time where our food inspection team was coming under a lot of fire about not doing all the food inspections that they needed to do. Of course, the problem is just simply having the labor force to be able to get it done. And so we saw the problem that they were having was A, they don't have enough inspectors to get the work done, something I think many governments can share of just not having enough resources to get work done. But the other problem was, or there was a potential opportunity in the sense of, well, how can we just do them more efficiently? So if there's 32 inspectors and 15,000 restaurants to do all the inspections, maybe we can prioritize where to go first. And so we're taking care of where the problems actually are, as opposed to somewhat, but not entirely, just randomly guessing where to send our inspectors. Randomly guessing is really an underestimation of what they do. They're doing work, they are trying to identify target areas, but across 15,000 restaurants, it's very hard to keep in your mind which ones are always the most risky ones and which ones are not the risky ones. So we identified a problem here. There's other ways to identify problems. Many cities, many governments have inspector generals. Those inspector generals are often writing reports. And there's an opportunity to read those inspector general reports because those are obviously pain points for commissioners, department heads, management who are trying to get work done, but problems or areas of improvement are being identified by somebody else. And of course, we can also work closely with departments to be able to listen to problems that they come to us with, problems that they talk about in meetings. Those are also opportunities to identify problems. In the context of food inspections, what we're trying to do, again, is just simply order restaurants to respond to the place that was risky first. So the illustration I have here kind of highlights that. Pardon me. Highlights that, where we take a list of typical order of inspections and we reorganize it based on the risk. So this sort of data-driven order of inspections. And hopefully we go to the places that actually cause food poisoning first, as opposed to going to a place that was safe and really wasn't a risk to the public. While we're still going to inspect them, we can deprioritize their inspection. And the problem looks like this. Across the entire city of Chicago is about 245 square miles with 32 inspectors and 15,000 restaurants. We're trying to pick a needle out of the haystack of which restaurant do we want to visit first. And so this presents an interesting challenge. So we're going to move on next to the ranking of the problems. So after we identify a bunch of problems, and in one case we've identified food inspections, we go on to ranking. So I'm going to turn over to Sean Thornton for this part of the presentation.
All right, thank you, Tom. So as Tom had said, in this part of the presentation, we're going to take a little step back. And while we're using food inspections as our main use case example for this presentation, a question for this step is, well, how was food inspections chosen in the first place? What was the process for getting to food inspections? And coming from a chief data officer's point of view, how do you kind of start identifying and then selecting and ranking these problems to begin with? A few years ago, Chicago began this process by hosting a workshop with 10 different city departments who had expressed interest to become involved in piloting and working on analytics projects in the city. So over a 2-day period, Chicago's Department of Innovation and Technology led workshops and sat down with mid-level managers from departments that included streets and sanitation, infrastructure, public health, management and budget, family and support services, as well as several others, and then sort of, one, explained what a predictive analytics project would look like, what its importance is, and two, how the generation of ideas is an important step for that. Because coming from the Department of Innovation and Technology's point of view, there's a knowledge on what the skills are needed to do so and how to actually crunch the data, but its data scientists aren't experts in the actual field work themselves. So in order to guide this workshop and help identify what use cases could be identified and then used, we came up with, there we go, a research question evaluation criteria list for predictive analytics projects. This handout is also available via the Ash Center as a handy tool or reference for what you'd like, if you'd like to, for your own use. So essentially, after explaining what analytics projects were, we asked departments to come up and identify what are some problems that your department faces, what are some operational difficulties, and what data sets or data do you use that might be helpful in addressing these problems. We started getting a flood of ideas, actually, but of course not all ideas are created equal. We heard ideas, for instance, like, well, Department of Sanitation has, or the Department of the fire department has issues with leaking fire hydrants. Is there a way that we can use fire data or fire hydrant data to help improve how we fix them? Not a bad question. But in order to really get the best questions, we need to make sure that there are certain characteristics that line up so that the project is feasible. This includes taking any given use case and looking at it in terms of data readiness, if data is associated with this research question is available or not, and is it ready to be analyzed. Policy alignment, is this something that's a particular goal of the city? Like in the example of fire hydrants, is this something that is really at the top of the city's priority list, or is this something that, maybe is a little bit further down? Operational impact, would this idea have a major effect on outcomes or a minor effect on outcomes? So again, with the fire hydrant example, how huge of an impact is this for neighborhoods and city streets? For residents' impacts, as a pilot, would this level of opportunity directly provide benefit to the residents of Chicago? This one's a particularly interesting one because a lot of ideas that were created during this workshop included ones that both enhanced internal efficiency and external efficiency that impacted residents. So this is certainly an important measure as well. Level of use, if this were to become a fully operational tool, what would it receive? For a fire hydrant, that might not be able to be used on a weekly or monthly basis. It might only be a couple times a year. And a potential for replication, both internally and if we have any partner cities that would be interested in sharing such information as well. If it's something like inspections or an inspection enhancing process, that same model or application could be used for other inspections across the city and thus arguably have more value than a one-off project which isn't particularly replicable. And lastly, the subjective question on the list, what's the impact on operational change? How drastically would things impact or alter current operations if we had a data science model impacted in your work? So this was a great schematic, one, for our workshop attendees to understand what a good use case looks like for predictive analytics. And two, this was a great evaluation tool for us to run our 200+ ideas from this workshop into a sort of final version. So with those 200+ ideas that we received, we did a rank order to see what were the ones that sort of rose to the top. We went from the top 200 to the top 50 to the top 25 to finally a set of 5 really strong candidates which we could move forward with. And one of those happened to be the food inspections restaurant case, which was one of the ones that we moved forward with and is obviously the example for this presentation. Oh, this one's fine. Okay, so once you've got a process chosen, like as the case with food inspections, the next move is to do a deep dive. So as Tom had mentioned, his analytics team refers to other departments as clients, and a lot of the analytics workshops view is almost kind of like as a team of consultants. Data scientists, again, know that their work, but they're not experts in food inspections. So part of the process is that deep dive to intimately know what it is that the food inspections team is doing. How does their work apply? What data is most relevant? How do they do their jobs? So this included interviews, ride-alongs, and developing a strong relationship with the chief of food inspections, who was very on board with the project. So I think we're going to pass this over now to Tom Schenk, who will be able to continue our 10-step guide.
Thanks, John. So what you see here in front of you is actually a picture of somebody doing a food inspection. So the deep dive helps us understand, what does this look like? So when we look at data and we look at numbers, we need to be very mindful that there's people doing work at the end of this. There's relationships, there's involvement. And something that this picture illustrates is, with food inspections in this case, it's a very hands-on process. Somebody needs to check for temperatures. I'm not sure if you can see there, but there's a thermometer in the food. And look at all the trays where they have to measure temperature. She's in there with a flashlight looking around in a refrigerator and in freezers. She's checking for coverings. This is a very involved process that takes time. So as we're working through the numbers, as we're working through the data, we're always trying to connect back what is likely happening at the scene, because the data is just a mere representation of what this process looks like. and we only get a certain amount of information of what this looks like. So this is an important thing. This is a very important process to help shape what we want to do next. But what comes from that is data acquisition, actually getting our hands on the data. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that. And in the context of food inspections, this one project that we're using as an illustrative example, one of the ways that we're able to get data is through our own open data portal. Now, my team manages open data, and they also manage predictive analytics. And we publish food inspections on the open data portal. We publish the inspections themselves, we publish 311 calls, we publish crime data, we publish a number of different data sources on the data portal. And that makes it very easy for our analytical team to get their hands on data. We don't really have to ask for permission of anybody else as soon as it is on the data portal. We don't have to jump through some of the hoops that you have to go to pull data from a database. So the open data portal is a valuable resource of data for analytical teams. So if you think about your open data programs and you think about in the context of enabling research, that's certainly the case, and it's a good practice to follow. Now, in addition to the data that's available on the data portal, there's other data sources. So here I have a diagram of showing which data sources we use for the food inspection program. Some of it is coming from the data portal, such as crimes, requests for garbage carts, sanitation complaints, business licenses, but we also pull in other data such as weather, which is not coming from our data portal, it's coming from other sources. Now, to identify which data sources are valuable, we work with the departments, we work with the manager, and we ask them, what do you think matters? What do you think is a good predictor here? Because what's important to remember is managers and people who work in this area have been working in this area for 20 years. They have a well-developed sense of intuition. And that well-developed sense of intuition is very valid to understand, hey, where should we look at first? We also read other research, if it's available, and try to identify what has mattered in other paths. If another city has done research in this area or work in this area, we try to figure out what variables matter there. So as we identify the list of data, and then try to get access to that data, whether or not it's an open data portal, whether or not it's a database, or whether or not that's some other third-party data that's available, we'll pull that data in. And as soon as we have our data, we can move on to model development. So this is where a data scientist and a statistician really gets to be a data scientist and statistician, to develop an analytical model to predict something. So for us, what we're trying to do is we're trying to combine data. We're trying to combine inspection data. We're combining historical data, such as the business licenses, the restaurants that are allowed to operate in the city, who the inspectors are and what they've done, the weather that's been around, sanitation complaints, crime, garbage carts. And then we create an actual model. We take all that data and we put it into an analytical model to predict something. And this is just simply what data scientists do. We worked on an analytical model. This process takes between 3 and 6 months. And this is where you can really empower your data scientists to do their analytical modeling. And so at the end of the day, we get a model. We have some sort of algorithm that we think is a good predictor for the outcome. Now, what are we trying to predict? Well, this is where you go back to step 2 and step 3, where we identify the research question. So the important thing is, what are we trying to predict? And step 2 and step 3 identify that. This step, step 5 here, is just simply creating the analytical model to be able to get that done. Now, for food inspections, what we found as significant predictors was whether or not the establishment has had a previous or critical or serious violation, the average 3-day high temperature before the inspection, nearby garbage and sanitation complaints, burglaries that happen nearby, whether or not the establishment has a tobacco or alcohol license, the length of time since we've last visited the restaurant, the length of time the restaurant has been opening, and the actual inspector who did the inspection. And this is, it turns out, one of the most important predictors, is that the inspectors were of varying quality. Some inspectors were very good and found a lot of violations, and other inspectors underperformed compared to the average. So we took all these pieces of data together, we did some research, and we found that these predictors were actually good predictors of what we thought was going to happen next. So after you have a model, and after we have a model that seems like it's doing well, and our data scientists feel confident in the model, and we're able to make some sense of it, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions about, you know, what each one of these variables mean, and I'll save that for the Q&A. One of the most important things that we do is a model review. And what a model review tells us is whether or not this model actually works. A model review is the evidence that we use to take to the department and say, we think this model is actually a good model. So the way that we sort of do this is that we have a test-train framework. And so we have a training period where we take data and we build a model, historical model, and we use that historical model, and we kind of let it sit on the shelf for a little bit. And then we try to predict future events based off of this model, based on historical data. Now, if this model is good, we should be able to predict we should be able to predict events that happen in the future with some accuracy and some reliability. And we have to do this before we can even measure whether or not this model is functional or not. Now, if we show that, yes, the model tends to be accurate, tends to fit pretty well, we can go to a department and say, look, we think this model works. We think this is a worthwhile model based on the evidence that we have so far. But that's not our only bit of evidence. For statisticians and data scientists on the call, I'm generally referring to cross-validation here. And so we're doing internal cross-validation. And it's not our only bit of evidence. If the department and we all agree that this seems like a good model, and we think this is a good model, we then go on to a pilot and experiment. Now, the previous step that I just referenced to, that internal cross-validation step I referenced, that's using data that we have already, using historical data that we have already. A pilot and experiment is actually trying to see if we can have the department make a decision based off of this data and based off of this analytical model. And so this is what it looked like for food inspections. What you see here is a graph of the number of inspections done over a period of time, from 2012 through 2014. And you notice there's a gap between that time. So what we did is we took data from 2011, 2012, 2013, and some of 2014, and we put that into our model. And again, we put it on the shelf and we let some time pass. Then we worked with the actual departments, and we worked with the managers, and we said, well, we're going to give you predictions of what's going to happen in the future, and we want your staff, we want your inspectors to go out into the field and do inspections based off of our predictions. And this is going to provide us some sort of validation to, A, make sure we can provide a prediction and make sure that the inspectors can go out and do that. But the way that we've done is we've actually designed a very particular experiment to help drive what predictions are done. Namely, it's an A/B test, or a treatment and control test. Some of the predictions we provide are based on what we actually think is going to happen. Some of the predictions we provide are actually sort of random, just random places to go. And what we're trying to measure is whether or not the predictions we provide that were deliberate are actually more likely to cause, or more likely to result in a failure, a failed outcome, compared to a random place that we visit. So this sort of experimentation, which is a sort of experimentation that you would see in cancer studies or education studies, is the experimental evidence that we need to have to actually know that it works. So after we launch a pilot and experiment, we need to do a pilot evaluation. We need to understand whether or not this actually works. So in the context of food inspections, we found that within the first 50% of the experiment, with the first half of the experiment, that the Department of Public Health found about 50% of the violations, that status quo. A little bit more than that, in fact. They actually found about 55% of their critical violations in that first half of the experiment, which is a little bit above fair. You might expect that during the first half of the experiment, they would find half of the violations, and then the last half of the experiment, they would find the other half. But what we found with the data-driven model, the predictive model, is that nearly 70% of the violations were found in that first half. That is to say, it worked, that we're finding the critical violations earlier. We were prioritizing correctly. Another way to express that is that over the course of a 2-month period, we were able to find critical violations 7.4 days earlier, just a little over 7 days earlier, a little over a week earlier. That's a week earlier over an 8-week period. And so that's a significant improvement in the speed that we're able to find critical violations. And yet another way to look at that is looking at the rate of violations over this rate of finding critical violations over the 2-month period. The red line that you see there is the status quo model. The blue line that you see in front of you is the data-driven model. Now, as the experiment was happening, as we're doing more and more inspections, that blue line is above the red line. That is to say that right away, the predictive model was finding more critical violations from week 1 and was finding more critical violations throughout the entire period. Up until the very end, you can kind of see that that blue line flattens out, it sort of tops off towards the end. That's because the predictive model was kind of found all the problem restaurants, whereas that red line was sort of still catching up. And so every single time that red line was finding a critical violation because it was finding it late in the game, that's a delay that we were not wanting to happen. And so we were seeing through evidence, through this pilot experiment, that the model was indeed functioning the way that we wanted to function. And so that gets into operationalizing the model. So as soon as we have some pilot evidence that, hey, this actually works, both using internal data, historical data that we have, and then also running a real pilot, a real live experiment, we find that this works. We need to focus on operationalizing that model, finding a way to actually deliver results on a day-to-day basis. So this is, going back to this diagram here, what you see here is we take data, existing data, current data, and then we take the historical model that we've already developed and we mash them together. So the big difference here is that historical data that we're using, that algorithm that we developed, and we need to create a way to combine current data and refresh that data every single day. So every single day that an inspection manager is trying to figure out where to send his or her inspectors, it's using the most recent information available, the most recent failures available, and also all the new businesses that have started up in the city who are now eligible for a restaurant inspection. All right. So as soon as we are able to put that into a current prediction score, we then build a small web application, a website that the manager visits to see where they should inspect first. And what this website looks like depends very heavily on what the actual manager wants to see. So this is what the way it looks like for the food inspection manager today. What you see there, and it's a little bit fuzzy, what you see there is a list of restaurants, their license number, their address, and some associated information. But one of the columns that you see there, or you might not quite be able to make it out, is actually the prediction score for that particular restaurant. Now there's a search box so the manager can search for a particular restaurant if she wants to, or can sort based off of address, or can sort based off of the name, or sort based off of the score, so she can go to the highest risk places first. There's a little button there that allows her to export to Excel because she specifically asked to be able to export to Excel because she knows how to operate data within Excel. So we really built this to her specification. Well, even though there's an interesting and somewhat complicated analytical model behind the scenes that's driving this, we want to make sure that this website, which is the point of interaction between the analytical model and the manager actually doing the work, we want to make sure that this is clean and easy and delivers what they need. Because it goes back to that first slide I showed you. What matters is the people who use and benefit from this algorithm and from this process. Now I'm going to mention something because I see a question come in here, and it's a good time. Somebody asked why let the model sit on the shelf, as I put it, kind of let it spoil. And the reason why is because it provides justification to make sure that we didn't overfit the model. So something that data scientists and statisticians are always very concerned of is something called overfitting. That we look at the historical data and that we try to develop the model to so perfectly fit historical data that it doesn't predict well. And this is a very known problem. This is one of those things that they teach you in school. Don't overfit your models. And I'm going back to a slide here which illustrates this, where we take historical data and we see the ups and downs in the historical data. And we can try to create an imaginary line that fits every single one of those ups and downs. But the problem is sometimes we're so focused on trying to fit the history that we're not trying to create something that could potentially predict the future. And so when we put it on the shelf, what it kind of guarantees for us is that we're not capturing only local trends. So, maybe for instance, in the last year, we've been really good about predicting restaurants. And maybe there's a certain trend that's been happening in the last year. Well, for us, by putting it onto the shelf, it allows time to pass by. And it helps us ensure that we're not just overly fitting the history and that we're not just sort of fitting the most recent trends, that we're actually capturing something that's more fundamental, that's more to the base of what's really generating why restaurants are failing and being able to predict that in the future. And while I'm talking about the analytical model for the data scientists, because I see questions come in on this analytical model, the model itself that we use, I'm going to go back to the slide here. The model that we actually used here is a fairly simple model from a data science perspective. It's a logit regression, a GLM style model with lassoed and regularized standard errors. And so we did weight some of the standard errors a bit differently. So for instance, we weighted a little bit more for the inspector because there was a bit more uncertainty there. But from a modeling perspective, fairly straightforward. GLMnet, we used R to be able to get that. The source code is online. I think we have a link to it a little bit later on. But if you go to Chicago's GitHub page, github.com/Chicago, you can find the food prediction model and you can find the R code that generates it. But from an analytical perspective, fairly straightforward and just simply a GLMnet. Trying to predict a binary outcome. Did the restaurant fail? Yes, no. Okay, so I'm going to jump back here. Thank you for those questions and points for me to be able to clarify. All right, so to bring folks back to where we're at, we're just talking about that front end. And so this is the website that somebody goes and sees predictions. So every single morning we take the most recent data, we take the model, and we present it in this website that the manager can get to, look at, and be able to drive for predictions. And this is really important to work with your operational folks. So for instance, give you an example, a question that we asked the manager goes, what time do you get in the morning? What time do you make your decisions to where to send your staff? And so we made sure all of our timing was right, and so all the most recent data would be available and the most recent predictions were available to her by the time she got into the office at 7 a.m. Okay. And the final step is not as involved. So after we create the application for the manager, after we say, here's the application, I hope everything works, email us if you have any questions. We make sure to invite that. We need to be able to be sure to check in and just send a note every once in a while. Hey, is the application working? Have you had any problems with it? Has it been up? Have you noticed any outages? Do you have any questions? And it's important to do that a couple weeks, or 1 week afterwards, a couple weeks after that, 1 month, 6 months, and every so often, anytime that I see the manager in a hallway or at a meeting, it's, Jaron, how's it going? Is the application okay? Do you have any questions? Because one thing that we do notice, and this is, I think, very true in IT sometimes, is that people don't always complain. If this seems more of a value add and not crucial, sometimes they don't complain to you if something doesn't work. And you want to make sure that they're communicating with you. You want to make sure that you're addressing any shortcomings that there is and providing that customer service to them. This is a new thing. This is a new sort of service. And so sometimes they don't know that it's okay to reach out to you, that it's not okay for something to go wrong, and this is something that they should expect to work for them and that they should be able to understand how it is working. One question that just came in here, often do you renew or revisit the model? This is a very good question. So we retrain the model every single day. So when we take in new data, we re-weight all the predictors. So for instance, I mentioned the inspectors is a very important predictor for this model. We weight that. That's a bit hard to say, but we reallocate the importance of every single one of those models based off of the most recent data that we have to make sure that our model is changing alongside of reality that's happening. Now, we're not incorporating new variables and we're not dropping off variables. We have not done that yet. We've not seen the need to quite yet to look at different sets of variables to include, so we're just simply retraining the model on a daily basis. Okay, so for those who want to find out a little bit more information about this model, including some of the things that, that we just talked about here today, you can go to this website that I have here, chicago.github.io/food-inspections-evaluation. And you can find some of that. You can find links to the code that I mentioned earlier. You can see more about the underlying source code and the analytical model. You can read more about the source data that we use. So you can find a little bit more about this particular food inspection model at this website. And of course, we presented these 10 steps in the context of this particular example. But I'm going to turn it over to Sean, and we're going to talk about how we've modified these 10 steps every once in a while to be able to gain the most out of partnerships and to be able to adapt to different challenges that we see.
Thank you, Tom. And to add on, in addition to the reference that Tom listed, Data Smart Cities also has kind of written case studies on the food inspections project, as well as many other analytics use cases that Chicago has done. So what you've just heard is the 10-step process for predictive analytics projects from a city government's point of view. So this is what Tom and his team go through as a guide to get projects done. However, this activity isn't done in isolation. In order to be really effective, there's partners across the board, whether they're internal ones, such as Department of Public Health, which we referenced throughout the 10-step process, or external ones. In particular, with external partners, Chicago has worked with local universities and academia, local nonprofits, civic hackers and volunteers with data-driven skill sets who would like to participate, and pro bono assets from corporations as well. And in particular, a lot of these partners can come in and provide support for specific parts of this 10-step model. So I'm going to first go over some of these partners and how we regularly work with them, and then two, provide an example of another analytics use case in which we actually moved a step completely outside of our domain and worked with a partner to do so. So who are these partners and what do they look like? One of our largest is a large, vibrant, productive civic community led by residents who are interested in technology and society. This group is in particular important because Chicago's work is being done for residents, and by having it done with residents, there's an additional sort of communal aspect so that people have a say in how these projects work out. Especially since open data is a foundation for a lot of this analytic work. That means that you don't need to be an employee of the city to access data that's being used. One of these groups that's been really important is the Smart Chicago Collaborative, which is funded by foundations, the Chicago Community Trust, MacArthur Foundation, and City of Chicago, to work on developing applications and programs to help bridge the digital divide in Chicago and make data better for residents to access. They have a program there called the CUT Group, even, Citizen User Testing Group, in which a lot of the applications or programs that are developed by the city can actually be tested by residents across the city's neighborhoods so that we understand how valuable they are for people in the city. In addition to Smart Chicago, they've actually recently changed their name to City Tech. So in addition to providing technology services and community services for the residents of Chicago, they've joined with a group called City Digital, which is focused on smart city development and enhancing the place aspect of Chicago to provide a more holistic view. So we continue to work with them on many projects, and they're a very valuable partnership. I had also mentioned the civic tech community and civic hackers as a key part of Chicago's work in analytics as well. So this little kind of sketch that says OpenGov Hack Night Happy 1 Year is now 4 years old. OpenGov Hack Night is one of Chicago's premier civic tech communities. And when it started back in, I think it was 2012?
Yeah.
2012 now. It consisted of a couple of really motivated people with programming backgrounds, maybe 3 or 4, who would get together, have pizza, and see how they can use data on the city's data portal to help craft projects that can improve life for the city's residents. Weekly meetups have been held over at Chicago's Merchandise Mart, which is a nexus of activity for Chicago's tech and startup sector. And from there, they just sort of created a synergy that grew. 5 years later, OpenGov Hack Night receives more than 100 visitors a night and has increased their influence quite a bit as well. Locally in Illinois, we're actually nearing a gubernatorial election, and all 5 candidates for governor for the Democratic Party actually stopped by and gave lectures at OpenGov Hack Night, which is something that 5 years ago the founders of this group probably would have found hard to believe. Another reason why this group is important is that Chicago's data and analytics team often pays weekly visits to these forward-thinking hackers so that we have that relationship with them. To know that, yes, we are happy to work with you, we are happy that you registered our data, and we encourage to continue this work. So it looks like we got a couple of questions here, too.
Let's save off on the questions. They're a bit more technical.
Okay, great. It looks like that those questions are for the prior section of the project. Yeah. So we'll continue going with the partnerships. So in particular, if you look at steps 1 through 10, step number 5, model development, is one where the Chi Hack Night community really comes in handy and has been a really valuable asset. Academic partners such as DePaul University, which is locally based in Chicago, have helped as well. Together with these 2 partnerships, one of Chicago's many civic analytics projects was done with their help almost entirely, and that is the Clearwater Project, which is forecasting water quality for Chicago's beaches. So as a quick context for what's going on here, Chicago has 26 miles of lakefront and I believe 22 beaches dotted across it. Especially during the summer months, for those of you who have visited Chicago, the beaches are quite popular. I think there are several million people who visit every year. And from a public health or park district official's point of view, the more the merrier, as long as everybody's safe. And safety means testing the water for possible contaminants, which include E. coli. And we want to make sure, of course, that the beaches are safe and that beachgoers aren't exposed to E. coli so that they don't get either some sort of sickness or nausea or further complications, which especially if you're a child or an older person could be very serious. So the process that the city had used for years was a culture-based test in which a park district employee would take a sample of water and within 18 to 24 hours would find out what the E. coli levels were. Now, this was somewhat effective, of course, but not fully effective because there would be a lag time that would mean beaches might have to be closed or opened without a 100% or fully confident reading. This was something that, since this data has been publicly available, also caught the eye of Chicago's civic tech community. There was one civic hacker in particular, a regular visitor of Chicago Hack Night, who created an app called Direct Beach, in which he encouraged residents to look up the local poop score for their Chicago beach. And even though there was a bit of humor involved, it actually provided a valuable public service because there wasn't any mechanism otherwise for the public to do so. So with Chicago's analytics team and Tom himself often visiting Hack Night, the creator of this app, a guy named Scott Beslow, actually came and visited and said, hey, I've got this app going. I think this actually could be a real service to the city. I'd love to partner and help and see what we can do. And this was something that Tom and the city of Chicago in particular was very on board with. So part of the structure of Hack Night, with its 100+ guests at this point, includes breakout groups, which sometimes number to 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, who work on specific projects using data to enhance city services or civic life. So that can include projects on enhancing biking services for residents or increasing voter turnout in local elections. Scott proposed to Tom that a group would be created around improving beach water inspections, which is what wound up happening. Through this partnership, they met every Tuesday night for roughly a year and guided themselves, Scott and a group of 5 core members, to look at Chicago's beach data and and thus create a model that can improve the current processes. Now, a quick explanation on the data used in that process. There are sensors throughout the lake in which readings are given that help sort of determine what beach quality may be, and a rudimentary equation or algorithm that the U.S. Geological Survey uses. However, much like the culture testing themselves, this one would often have a lot of false negatives and not have the right responses all the time. So what the group did was, in addition to sensor data, they used additional streams of data that weren't previously factored, such as weather data from NOAA or precipitation levels or pollution data or other relevant sources that are on the city portal or elsewhere to create a new algorithm. They created one which wound up actually having a positive impact and was set to be tested for the following year. The following year, the city's park district then decided to roll out DNA level testing, which is obviously an improvement from culture-based testing, however, is also very expensive. So with a new partner stepping in, which was in the form of student volunteers and student support from DePaul University, both the Civic hacking group and DePaul students worked to figure out a model that would use prediction from a select number of DNA sensors across Chicago beaches so that the city would be able to concentrate its resources where it needed most. Now, this information for the full specifics is also available on Chicago's GitHub page and as well as on DataSmart, but through the testing, DeWitt found that the Clearwater project was able to issue water quality advisories with 3 times more accuracy than previously used forecasting models from the U.S. Geological Survey. So that's quite a leap, and one that the team was quite proud of, and one that, in addition to the city being proud of, one that Chi-Hack was quite proud of as well, because obviously more accurate modeling means a reduced risk for residents at beaches. Another tongue twister there. So, if you total all the hours of work from the Chi-Hack Night group, from DePaul University, and from many other partners, that's 1,000 pro bono hours that were given to this project, which were entirely not on the city's dime, and which were incredibly valuable. If you look over here at this GitHub punch card, you could see that Tuesday is one of the busiest days of the week, except for someone really ambitious on Saturday at 8 a.m., but the contributions cannot be understated here. And most recently, actually, Chi-Hack Night is gearing up to publish its first ever scientific paper on the Clearwater project, with Chi-Hack Night listed as the primary authors along with city staff. So this is really a great sample of how a group like Chi-Hack Night, or various other partners, depending on who you may work with or who you may be able to work with in your area, can assist in one of the 10 guides of the 10-step guide. So to wrap things up, I'm going to pass things over back to Tom, who will provide another example of a partnership or a change to the 10-step guide, as well as answering some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I'm going to take just a minute here. There's a couple of questions that came through. I think it's a good time to answer some of these questions before moving on to the final and brief section. First, I got to say, for those who are familiar with GitHub, this is a graph that you've been able to make in GitHub for quite some time. I've never found a use case for it, except for this very particular use case, where you can really see that work being done on a Tuesday evening when our civic hackers are getting together. And in fact, the evenings themselves of people doing work at 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night, making a contribution to us. I've never seen that captured so vividly in a graph, and so it brings me a good amount of pleasure in seeing that. Okay, so a couple of questions. A question came in is, can you please share where we can find the research question evaluation criteria that was displayed earlier? We'll work with the ASH staff in making sure that that link gets sent out or highlighted in the deck later. We'll make sure that there's links in the post materials that you see after this presentation. Thanks for the question. Another question here, there's a few questions about the analytical model, and so and about the food inspection analytical model, and so we'll address those here. So question, was the idea to improve productivity by reducing the amount of work necessary, or did workload remain the same but criticals were addressed earlier? Yeah, it's the latter. Our focus was, we knew that we weren't going to curtail staff. That certainly was not needed. But workload remained the same, but we're able to address the critical problems earlier. But this is the nice thing about this project. In one respect, the pressure was because we were not doing all the inspections. In a lot of respects, we said, okay, that's true. We need to hire more staff. And since then, the city is still trying to hire more food inspectors. There's still a gap there. But what we really want to focus the conversation on is, well, let's do this intelligently. If we can't do it all, let's make sure we do it intelligently. And I think a lot of people in the public look at that, and people have recognized this, and people have written subsequent articles that were more kind about this in the local press, saying, yes, this is a smart way of doing it. Yes, you're not doing them all, but this is still a smart way of doing that, and you get lauded for that, and that's fantastic, and that's a real service that we can provide another department, is focusing on efficiency, where sometimes we have very hard ceilings of being able to get work done. Another question, technical question a bit. Following the implementation of the model, are there steps to revalidate? For instance, run more A/B tests. You know, I got to say, I didn't focus too much on it for the presentation today, but we often fail our tests the first time around. We often realize that we've misunderstood something fundamental about operations, and so sometimes we run multiple pilots to try to figure out whether or not it works. Now, I think what the question's getting at is, okay, you run a pilot, you implement the model, do you do tests down the road? And usually we don't, for a couple of reasons. One is we need to move on to the next project. And two, when we run our pilots, those are pretty high quality experiments, you know, double-blind A/B tests with different research designs. I think that's some of the best evidence that we can ever ascertain about the effectiveness and the quality of a model. And so we don't focus as much down the road of running other tests. One, because it's not quite as pure as that first test we did, and then two, because our own limitations, our own constraints of needing to do something else. Another question, can you elaborate on precision versus recall in the model selection, if applicable? This is a great question. We almost always have to, we absolutely have to address this in every model. And there's a couple of ways that we approach it. For those on the folks who are not sure what it is, of precision versus recall, I'll very briefly summarize it like this. It's basically a question of, okay, how much do I want to be sure that I find the restaurants that actually have these problems, and what is the proportion of folks that I falsely don't identify? So there's two different ways of being wrong. Sometimes I'm wrong because I go to a restaurant that actually doesn't have a problem, even though I thought it was going to have a problem. And then there's another side of it, which is I'm wrong because I failed to identify a restaurant that had a problem. And so therefore we failed to inspect it first because it was a major problem. So you can be wrong in a couple of ways when it comes to statistics. So the question is, well, which way do we want to favor on being wrong? And in the context of food inspections, our thought process was this. Well, we need to inspect the restaurants anyway. We still need to inspect every single restaurant. That has not changed. And so therefore, we're a bit more inclusive. If we're going to be wrong, we would rather be a little bit more inclusive and maybe go to a restaurant that was flagged early that actually wasn't a problem, as opposed to missing a restaurant that had a problem that we miss. Because if we miss and we fail to identify a restaurant that has a problem or was a potential cause of food poisoning, that means people get sick. If we go to a restaurant that actually wasn't at the top of the list, but we put it on the top of the list, the quote-unquote bad thing is that we've done an inspection that we're going to need to do anyway. And so we favor the inspection a little bit more based off of that logic. And sometimes that logic changes over time. Sometimes it can be extremely inconvenient to do an inspection in other research cases. Sometimes it's inconvenient to do an inspection or costly to do an inspection. So we need to be mindful of that and maybe not lean the model that way so much. So that's a great question. I'm also working on we're working on a technical paper where we're going to explain this in more detail, because this is a question that often comes up. So I'm gonna answer one question. I'm going to jump back into the presentation. I'm going to answer the rest of these questions. But one question I'll answer now before moving on to the presentation: has predictive analytics reduced or increased the cost for client departments? It's reduced cost. It's an internal service that we're providing. We're not reaching out and paying people really a lot of money to do this sort of work. It's mostly internal resources. It's partnerships that Sean has mentioned to be able to get this done. And so we're able to do more work. It's more about efficiency. We're able to do more work, and we're able to do it more efficiently given a certain amount of resources. And that's the way that we try to do. That's the objective that we're trying to achieve here. Okay, I'm going to move on to the presentation. A couple more slides, and then we'll come back to more Q&A if there's time. All right, so what Sean has talked about was in step 5 on developing the model. When there's that step 5 there where we're actually developing the analytical model, sometimes we can work with partners to develop the analytical model as opposed to doing that internally. So in the 10 steps, step 5 sometimes can be supplemented by outside partnerships. And even though we are doing the other steps, steps 1, step 2, 3, 4, and step 9 and 10, we can leverage partnerships to get pro bono in-kind contribution for step 5. Now, what I'm going to talk about is how in step 9, the operationalizing the model, how we can find operational partners to get work done. So give you a particular example of a project that we're working on is trying to identify kids who have elevated lead poisoning. Now, in Chicago, the main source of elevated lead levels in a child's and infant's blood is coming from lead paint. These are often older homes that have not been renovated, homes that have been built before 1974. This is a problem that does exist today. We've made tremendous strides in it. The Department of Public Health has done a tremendous job of reducing that, but we want to reduce it even further because it's a very, very costly condition that inflicts children that really impacts their ability to learn, their long-term earnings levels, of all of that. So we developed an API, a lead-safe API that predicts, an analytical model that predicts whether or not a kid has elevated lead levels in their blood. So the analytical model has been developed of, okay, do we think that this child is going to have elevated lead levels? However, one of the problems that we had was, how do we intervene with the child and their family? Now, what's different about elevated lead levels in a child's blood versus a restaurant is a restaurant is a public place of business. An inspector can walk in based on a hunch to a restaurant and say, I want to inspect you. As long as it's a restaurant and it's not egregious or anything like that, it's a public place. The problem with elevated lead levels is that this is a private home. This is an individual's home. We, as a city, cannot just simply go into a home and start looking at their walls. We need to have a conversation with the parent, to invite us into that home, to ask us to take a look at their walls. So the model that we're developing is actually not for us. The model is being developed for local hospitals. So when a child, an infant walks into a hospital, or not walks into a hospital, is carried into a hospital, goes into a hospital, that electronic medical record gets sent to the city of Chicago, and we're able to give a prediction of, we think that this child is very likely to have elevated lead levels. There should be a conversation with the parent to make them aware of the risk. There should be additional blood testing. There should maybe be a visual inspection. But what's interesting is that the doctor is going to be able to have that conversation with the parent, because the doctor is much more well suited to have a conversation with the family member about the dangers of elevated lead levels. There's trust there. There's expertise there. There is talking about the health of a child in a way that a doctor can talk about it that we cannot from a public health or analytical perspective. And so this is finding an operational partner. So when we operationalize a model, sometimes it's not always about directing our own staff. Sometimes it's trying to communicate with external partners to make a decision differently. Now in the city, we're well positioned. We have the data. We're able to build models, and we developed this model in collaboration with the University of Chicago. We're able to do that work. But when it comes to actually operationalizing this model, this was something better left at the hospitals. So that's the remaining of the presentation. I'm going to put up a summary slide so you can see some of the stuff that we referenced here today. Contact information, feel free to use it, and websites. Jessica, Catherine, do we have time to do a couple of questions here that I have in front of me? Or what's, I think there's a couple more. Okay. So I'm going to answer a couple questions. When retraining post-implementation, how do you validate efficacy? A simple count of critical violations might seem like it might have a problem, meaning that you might find more violations where you're expecting them because you're looking for violations. So this is a good question, and in some research projects, this is a critical question. Now, one of the things that we didn't really explain very well about the food inspection model is that we're looking for critical violations. So we're looking for any time that there's at least one violation that's deemed critical. That is to say, a critical violation is defined as something that can actually really cause food poisoning. Oftentimes, that's failing to maintain the temperature of the food. And so this is something, when it came to efficacy, this is something we look towards the subject matter experts and say, what matters? What violations actually can get people sick? And so they help specify that for us, where we're looking at the violations that matter as opposed to just counting violations and saying, well, okay, this is where we want them. So I think that answers the question. There might have been a bit more nuance to that, and if I didn't capture that, I apologize. And one final question, is there an online collection or portfolio of the projects mentioned here? I think this is a great time for Sean and actually the Ash Center in general to talk about some of the writing here where you can find use cases that have been discussed. Sean?
Yeah, certainly. So we have on our thank you slide a list over here of some references that Tom included. These are from the City of Chicago, which include Data.City of Chicago, Digital City of Chicago, Open Grid, our city's tech plan, and the speaker deck. Data.ash.harvard.edu is the DataSmart webpage, which includes case studies and lots of writings that I've personally done on the City of Chicago, which include all of these. And also the City of Chicago has a GitHub account, which includes a portfolio of these projects, so sort of a more direct thing of what this question is looking for. We'll also be posting some supplementary materials from this webinar, including the handout that we had included earlier, as well as video of this webinar itself. So if there are any follow-up questions for Tom or myself, please let us know. We'd be more than happy to engage. And again, thank you for spending your hour with us, and we hope that this was of value.
Thank you very much, everybody. It was a pleasure chatting with you all.